Hello everybody, my name is Fernando S.P. Forsen and I am a psychiatrist working now in the United States, and now in this lecture series we're going to review the history of psychiatry. This is going to be the first lecture and we're going to review history of psychiatry from prehistory until the modern era. It is important to know that psychiatry, the history of psychiatry can go back as far as the times of prehistory, in which we have shamanistic medicine. Evidence of shamanistic medicine, in which herbs or mushrooms or other things could be used for the treatment of spiritual care, is evidenced in the cave paintings that we have found nowadays. For example, an example is Algiers. Also with trepanation, which consists of doing like a hole in the skull of a person. There is evidence of that at least for 4,000 years before the Common Era. The purpose of trepanations is not well understood nowadays because we don't have any document that explains what this treatment consisted of, but it is thought that was related to some kind of spiritual care that was at the time mixed with people who possibly could have neuropsychiatric symptoms. And we have evidence of some skulls that have been found that have osteophyte regeneration in the skull. So some patients or some people survived to these methods of trepanation. Also in Egypt, we have the Evers papyrus, from George Evers, and this papyrus actually points out to the heart as an organ that could play an important role in mental disease. Actually, it is thought that according to the Egyptians, when the person will have depressive symptoms of dementia, what we call now dementia or cognitive problems, the heart of the person could go morose and it could have problems in functioning. This was also related to Aristotelian philosophy, in which the heart was considered the primus motor, like the organ that would be the primus organ that to allow the body to function. So just to know, like nowadays, when a person says, "You broke my heart," or a person is suffering from romantic disappointment and say, "My heart is broken," this comes back from Egyptian and Greek times. Hippocrates is a very important physician, considered the father of medicine nowadays in Europe and also in the United States. Doctors commonly do the Hippocratic oath. Hippocrates actually existed, and we have evidence of that from the dialogues of Plato. And what we know is that Hippocrates, and already Hippocrates started the Hippocratic school. And in the Hippocratic school, mental illness was considered a medical problem. So already in Greek times, mental illness was considered a medical problem that should be treated by physicians. So Hippocrates believed that there was an imbalance between the four humors, named as the phlegm, the black bile, the yellow bile, and the blood. And this imbalance in these humors could cause disease. So the Hippocratic school argued for the use of purging, for the use of using medicines for purging, for diet, exercise, in order to restore the balance of the humors. Also in Hippocratic school, we have one of the first known classifications of mental disease, using classifying mental disease in a way that we could possibly classify even nowadays. So as such, Hippocrates suggests, for example, mania, the diagnosis of mania, that a person with agitation and uncontrolled behaviors. This would be a different spectrum of diseases in today's classification. But mania has been used in classic time and in classic literature as an uncontrolled rage and a person that is out of control, a person that is completely out of control. Then Hippocrates used the diagnosis of melancholy or melancholia for people who will have symptoms that resemble nowadays depression. Then he used the diagnosis of phrenesis for people who have agitation but also with fever and other memory and cognitive problems. So we have this diagnosis that could well be helpful for classification of diseases that we would use today in psychiatry. Galen was another physician in the 1st century. He was a Greek physician as well, but he already belongs to Roman times, when during the Roman Empire eventually took over Greece and conquered all the known world at the time, all Europe and all the known world of the time, the East and the West. So Galen, who was a Greek physician from the city of Pergamon, that Pergamon is today in Turkey, eventually went to Rome and became a very famous physician in the empire. Galen embraced Hippocratic medicine, and he embraced the humors and the humoral theory, but he also advocated for a more aggressive treatment. And those, an example of that was bloodletting, which means like the blood of a person could go bad, and you could just make the person bleed out so that the patient or the person eventually would generate new blood, and that way you would be more aggressive, or you would get a treatment that potentially could be more effective in the restoration of the imbalance in the 4 humors to restore health. So that could be applied for mental problems, but also for medical problems. The idea was to use it for medical problems. Bloodletting was a treatment that has been used until 19th century. For example, President George Washington had bloodletting, and it is thought that one of the reasons that precipitated his death is excessive bloodletting after he had a pulmonary affection. And we can see pictures of 19th century people receiving bloodletting for several medical conditions. Galen also believed that people could have temperament, and the temperament is used nowadays for personality, right? So temperament is biologically inherited, right? So temperament plus character would be personality. So Galen argued that depending on the higher amount of one of these 4 substances, 4 humors, a person could be phlegmatic, sanguinolent, melancholic, and choleric. And these personality classifications are still used nowadays. So people will have classified personality disorders, or also we can classify personalities based on Jungian psychology and other different classifications that we have in the history of psychology. Dioscorides, D-I-O, I have an accent, so some of these words I'm going to have to spell. D-I-O-S Corides. So Dioscorides was a Greek physician who came out with the first pharmacopoeia. So the pharmacopoeia is all the treatments and plans that could be used for medical treatment at the time, and potentially restore the balance in these humors. So these 3 Greek physicians, Dioscorides was also a Greek physician in the 1st century during Roman time, but still a Greek physician. These 3 physicians, Hippocrates, Galen, and Dioscorides, become the 3 most prominent physicians during the rest of the history of medicine until the Enlightenment. So people studied these classic physicians for treatment of medical problems and mental problems at the same time. My accent is from Spain, by the way. So with the popularity of Christianity in the Roman Empire, after Constantine the Great declares Christianity, legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire, a spiritual approach for the treatment of mental problems becomes very popular. After Theodosius I, the emperor who declared Christianity the official religion, Christianity becomes pretty much the most popular religion in the empire. So what happens to that is, like in Europe, at least in Western Europe, many of these classic texts of medicine becomes lost, or the knowledge becomes fragmented, and a spiritual approach to mental health in the early Middle Ages become prominent. So it was popular that, following the model of Jesus in the Gospel, who practiced exorcisms for the treatment of the mentally ill, many priests and followers of Christianity would use the same. They would get inspiration, or they would get inspired by the Gospels, and they would treat people with mental afflictions, or at the time psychological, neurological, or medical afflictions, with exorcism. So diseases that in the past would have been considered in the Hippocratic medicine as a person having mania or melancholia, now could be approached also spiritually. The monasteries that became popular all over Europe during the Middle Ages, people go to the monasteries, and many pilgrims go to these monasteries to receive spiritual care, to visit relics, but also there were gardens with medical plants, and there was some medical knowledge, and they built hospitals to treat the pilgrims. But many people potentially could get exorcisms as a way of getting treatment. Was exorcism helpful for the treatment of people with mental illness or mental problems? History in psychiatry has said that a lot of these patients were neglected or mistreated. But if we put things in historical context, what could be a better treatment for a person who have for a society that is dominated by Christianity, and for a person who is very religious and very Christian, that the treatment proposed by Jesus in the Gospels? As it is obvious, it would be way more helpful for a person that had a mental affliction or a psychological problem to get the treatment proposed by Jesus in the Gospel, practiced by the priest in the monastery, could be potentially more effective than any of the somatic treatments that we have nowadays in society. So it's important that we put things in the historical context. What was going on during the early Middle Ages in the other side of Europe? So we saw in Western Europe religious treatment or spiritual treatment become prominent. But in contrast, in Islam, after the what is called the Umayyad Empire, which capital was in Damascus, they take all over the Middle East, and they take North Africa. And in this Umayyad Empire, the Greek schools remain open. And that was the example of in the area what is known today as Iran, where you had the Persian physicians. These Persian physicians continued the classic medicine in the hospitals. So the Iranian word for hospital is Maristan or Bimaristan. So Maristan or Bimaristan is the Persian word for a hospital. So there, people continued the classic medical treatments such as Hippocrates or Galen or Dioscorides. So that was continuous in these Bimaristans. And what becomes during the early Middle Ages? During the early Middle Ages, the capital of the world becomes Baghdad, the city of Baghdad in Iraq. So the city of Baghdad in Iraq becomes the most prominent city in Europe at the time. And many famous physicians go there to work. One known physician is the physician called Rhazes. Like Rhazes is Rhazes, and Rhazes follows the humoral theory of Hippocrates to treat mental and physical problems, and also he's one of the founders of the famous Bimaristan of Baghdad during the 9th century. Other physicians, there is Avicenna. Avicenna is a very important physician to remember for anybody interested in the history of medicine. Avicenna, which name I will spell now, is Avicena. Sorry, I won't have to spell many names, but Avicenna is important to remember. He writes the Canon of Medicine, and this Canon of Medicine that he writes in year 1020 of the Common Era, that's an Aristotelian classification. Aristotle had been lost in Western Europe, and people didn't know about it at the time. But this person that Aristotle was still existed in Islam, in the Islamic Empire. That's an Aristotelian classification of all the physical, medical, and mental problems. So he, for example, discusses the diseases classified by organs. For example, people could have diseases of the heart, diseases of the lungs, diseases of the liver, and this is how we classify medicine nowadays. You can become a cardiologist, you can become an hepatologist, you can become a pulmonologist. So you see, this is how important this textbook made an influence in the Islamic Empire and then it was later translated in Europe and made an impact, because this textbook called the Canon of Medicine becomes the standard textbook in all Europe after it's translated from Arab into Latin. It becomes the standard textbooks in all Europe in medical schools until the middle of the 17th century. So this becomes probably the most important medical textbooks in the history of medicine. And in this textbook, the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna, he discusses also the classical Hippocratic mental diseases that he called the diseases of the passions. So he discusses mania, he discusses melancholia, he discusses hysteria. Hysteria was considered a problem of the uterus. Now people have different classifications like histrionic personality or conversion disorder or somatic symptom disorder, but he discusses all that as well that was inherited from Hippocratic medicine. He discusses the dreams, the interpretation of dreams, and the importance of dreams. So the Canon of Medicine in Avicenna become the most important textbook in the history of medicine because it lasted for a few hundred centuries. And this was written in Baghdad. Then we have also the school of translation. So what happened is like how all this Greek medical knowledge of the way of classifying mental disorders, how did it get back to Europe? How did Aristotle go back to Europe? How did all this medicine go back to Europe? And this is because of the school of translations. The most important school of translations that they translate these texts, medical texts, or all the knowledge like philosophy or mathematics, algebra, etc. This was translated from Arab into Latin by people who would know both languages. So one of the most important ones is started in Sicily, but also in the area of what is known today as Spain. So, for example, during the Reconquista, which is the time that the Christian territory started to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula, what is known today as Spain. For example, the King Alphonse VI arrives in the city of Toledo and finds like a library with a lot of medical textbooks, and there is a lot of people from all over Europe, from Western Europe, go to Spain to translate this text. And there is the example of this person called Gerard of Cremona. Gerard of Cremona was an Italian humanist of Cremona in Italy, and he goes to Toledo and translates the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna that was found there in Toledo in Arabic, that becomes translated into Latin. And after translated it into Latin, that was the official language in Western Europe at the time, what we call the Latin West, which is Western Europe, that knowledge gets transmitted to the other countries, to what is known France or England, and etc. So that becomes like an important revolution. In Spain, another king later, called Alphonse X, he starts other school of translations, like the School of Translation of Seville, once they reconquer Seville, or in Murcia, 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 which is a city in the southeast of Spain that I recommend everybody to visit because it's my hometown, actually, in Spain. So, also, where were the first hospital for the mentally ill? People has classically said Bedlam. Bedlam in London was the first psychiatric hospital. This is a little controversial and a little tricky, and there is really no consensus. What I would say about Bedlam or Bethlehem Royal Hospital is that it was a hospital that was founded in the 13th century in London, and that was initially was a foundation, and then later it became a hospital. And this hospital was started because at the time, for people who like history, may know that at the time there was the Crusaders, and the Crusaders had gone to Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and they have taken these cities because they were the cities of the Lord, of Jesus, and they tried to take those cities back so that those territories can be Christians, because they at the time were taken by the Umayyad Empire. So for a while the Christians had the Jerusalem for a few decades, until then it was taken back again by the Muslim, but this time this was the Turks in the Ottoman Empire. So after that, people with the frustration of having lost the city of Bethlehem and Jerusalem, they founded the Hospital of Bethlehem in London. And this hospital, we know that in the 13th century, at the time that it was founded, that it was 1247 in the Common Era, in an area that now in London would be the Liverpool Station. So for people who go to London, where is Liverpool Station now, that's where Bethlehem Hospital was originally in the 13th century. And in this hospital had a medieval usage of the hospital, that pilgrims could go there, homeless, beggars could go there for charity and for medical treatment as well. And we know that people with dementia, people who had lost their cognitive skills, were also residing in this hospital. And there is some evidence that this could be some of the first or earliest evidence of hospitals having actually hospitalized people with mental illness. Does it make it the first psychiatric hospital in the world? Well, to begin with, Bedlam was a general hospital, and there were other general hospitals in the world at the time. So this is hard to tell which one was the first who started accepting. If they were following classic medicine, any hospital that followed classic medicine would admit people with mental problems as well in any medical hospital. And also the Bimaristan like the one in Baghdad, or other Bimaristan that were open over all the Islamic Empire, would admit people with mental problems as well, like the Bimaristan of Damascus or Fez or Egypt, in El Cairo, or the one in Granada. Actually, during the Middle Ages, there was a famous Bimaristan in Granada under the Islamic rule, because the Umayyad Empire had also the capital later in Cordoba, and there in Cordoba they continued an Islamic hospital in Granada, where people could get the classical Greek treatment. So this, when people try to get, the point is, like, when people try to make Bedlam or one hospital more important than other, I think the debate shouldn't be there. All medieval hospitals at the time probably admitted people with mental health problems. What is probably known as or we know in the Latin West, or in Western Europe, as the first hospital who was funded for the treatment of the mentally ill, was the hospital in Valencia, in the Kingdom of Aragon, that today anachronically we could say is the hospital in Spain. And this hospital was called, in Valencia, the hospital for St. Mary. It was called the Hospital of St. Mary of the Innocents, the Fools, and the Demented. In the Valencian, which is the Valencian dialect at the time, would be called the Innocents, Fools, Llorats. And in this hospital, the reason that this hospital was funded is because there was a priest called the Father Joffre. It's very important to remember, Father Gilabert Joffre, and Joffre will be J-O-F-R-E. Father Joffre actually was a priest that started after he saw how a few people were being abused. A few people were abusing a mentally ill person in the street. He decided to protect this person, and the following week he gave a sermon in the cathedral asking for people to start a hospital just to protect people from being mentally ill men from being physically abused in the street, and mentally ill women from being physically and sexually abused in the street. And he asked for people to collect money to start this hospital in the city of Valencia. And this hospital, this speech and this sermon was heard by Lorenzo Salom and other people who were members of the bourgeoisie, and he started collecting the foundation to found what is probably known as evidence of the first specific foundation of a hospital for the treatment and protection of the mentally ill in Europe. There might be another one, but this is the one that we know. And the door, actually, of this hospital can be visited today in Valencia. This hospital was later suffered devastation in a fire in the 16th century, but the door is still preserved and can be visited in Valencia. And in what is known of the Iberian Peninsula of Spain, after that, we see the foundations of other hospitals across the Iberian Peninsula in what is known today in Spain during the 15th century. So that's the example of the hospital of the Holy Cross in Barcelona, the hospital in Cordoba, the hospital in Lérida, the hospital in Palma de Mallorca in Spain, in Granada, the Royal Hospital as well. So we see the foundation of hospitals, general hospitals or psychiatric hospitals all over the Iberian Peninsula in Spain, and probably in other areas in Europe as well. Some of these hospitals today actually we have inherited the information on how was the treatment there. For example, in the hospital in Toledo, which was another psychiatric hospital that was founded in 1480, there was already this hospital for the mentally ill in Toledo. It was founded by this person called Francisco Ortiz. And in this hospital in Toledo, what we see in the constitutions when the hospital was founded is that he said, Francisco Ortiz himself, because we have inherited this document, that it was very important to the patients should be chained or in restraint until they could be appropriately evaluated, to evaluate for safety. It was important also that everybody had a room, everybody had a bed, everybody had clothes. There was a strong emphasis on hygiene. There was a strong emphasis in cleaning. In this hospital in Toledo, it was important. Francisco Ortiz recommends that people waters the wine. In Spain at the time, everybody drank wine. People didn't drink much water. Even nowadays, people drink a lot of wine in Spain. But it was important to water down the wine by watering down the wine, the madness, wouldn't get worse. That was the idea. So there was some knowledge about alcohol that could worsen mental health problem. There is also some documents with the medicines used at the time, and some of these medicines were root infusions that could help restore the balance of the humors. Classic medicine, which is the Hippocratic medicine, was used there to treat mental problems. So that's the idea that exorcisms were used until the Enlightenment. That's not correct. I mean, exorcisms have been used, even nowadays, people use exorcisms in some communities and in some churches, but during the modern era, in Spain, for example, classic medicine was used to treat mental illness as well, and these coexisted. These two things coexisted. So occupational therapy was important, workshops were important, and those patients who participated in workshops were thought to have a better prognosis. Also, they used alchemy. Alchemy was revolution medicine, because with alchemy you can use natural plants and you can combine it with minerals. So alchemy becomes very important in the Middle Ages and in the modern era, and that would lead to the way we use pharmacology nowadays. So medicines, for example, there was a medicine called hormigos that was a mix of mercury and ashes, and this mix of mercury and ashes called hormigos was used to treat patients with agitation, and it was already happening in Toledo in Spain in 1480. So when they tell us that classic medicine was not used and then the Enlightenment came and everything changed, this is not true. We have good evidence that during the Middle Ages and the modern era, a medical approach was taken to treat the mentally ill. For example, some of the classification of disorders that we have been recovered nowadays. So it's not like, oh, you were crazy or you were mentally ill and that's it. No. For example, in Seville, there is documents from the 17th century in which we have a list of disorders that were the most commonly used in the 17th century in the city of Seville, in the Hospital of the Innocents, the mentally ill in Seville. And the most common diagnoses were melancholy, this is from Hippocratic medicine, mania, thinking excessively. I mean, that reminds us of generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, being silly or simple. I mean, that's the current intellectual disabilities. Amentia, which is without your mind. I mean, that could be anybody with cognitive problems or delirium or what we know now today as dementia. Lack of reason and judgment. This is something we see in some, people nowadays, and a lot of people have lack of reason and judgment. Uterine fury, that's what probably referring to the Hippocratic concept of hysteria, of people having the histrionic personality, or the conversion disorders, or the somatic symptom disorder, what we call nowadays functional neurological disorders. Transient delirium with fever, this is the encephalopathies, the encephalitis, the delirium. So there was a knowledge and an understanding of diseases that can be classified in a way that we can see very easily the equivalents in today's classification and in today's mental problem. So it's important to note that. With the expansion of European expansion, in the overseas, in America especially, and also in the Philippines, we see that these ideas of classic medicine become exported. My research, I'm a little bit biased because my research is focused on the history of psychiatry in the Hispanic world. But what we know is, for example, once Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico, he founds the Hospital of Jesus Nazarene in Mexico City. Pizarro also allowed for the foundation of hospitals in Lima. In Santo Domingo, Nicolás de Obando, who was the judge that came with Columbus, also founds the Hospital of St. Nicholas of Bari. The same in Argentina. In the Philippines, the same thing. When the Spaniards arrived in Manila, after Legazpi founded the city of Manila, the Basque sailor Legazpi, they found the Royal Hospital for the Spaniards in 1577. Then a hospital for the natural Indians, that's the way they would call the Filipino people at the time, in 1578. A lot of Chinese people went to Manila to work, and in Manila you had the first Chinatown in the modern era, or the first Chinatown in history, and they found the hospital of St. Gabriel for the Chinese community there. And then the Hospital of St. Lazarus for the lepers, that is still open nowadays. If you're in Manila and you go to St. Lazarus, you can visit the hospital. There was also the foundation in Mexico City, the foundation of a specific hospital for the treatment of the mentally ill. And this would be the first hospital in the history of the modern world, of the New World in America, or the European culture in America, founded in the new continent, in the American continent. And this was founded by a soldier called Bernardino Alvarez. And this Bernardino Alvarez is a Bernardino. I mean, I'm not gonna spell that, but it's very long. But Alvarez would be Alvarez. Spaniards and Spanish people have difficulty sometimes spelling, because there you write words the way you pronounce them. So when I moved to the US 10 years ago is when I had to actually learn how to spell. You know, I didn't know how to spell before that. But this Bernardino Alvarez was a soldier who went to Mexico, and he participated there at the Chichimeca conflicts with the Indians or Mexicans that were in north of Mexico City. And after that, he was incarcerated because after he served in the army, he became fond of playing cards. He became involved in a homicide, and he was incarcerated. So he was offered to go to China, but he refused to go to China because at that time there was an idea of trying to conquer China when people were trying to, the Spaniards were trying to go to the Philippines. He didn't want to go there because many people would die in those expeditions, and it was dangerous. And eventually he was able, after he seduced a woman, a lover, allowed him to escape from jail in Mexico City, and then he went to Peru. And in Peru he became very rich as a trader, and eventually 30 years later he returned to Mexico City to find out that his father had died, and he received a letter from his mother. And in this letter from his mother said that he should start a pious life, like a religious life. So he had a religious awakening, and this Bernardino Alvarez, at this point in his life, when he was already in his 60s, he becomes a friar. And after he became a friar, he used all the money that he had collected in his life to found the hospital of San Hipólito. And this hospital of San Hipólito that you can today still visit in Mexico City, I went there myself. I would recommend everybody that goes to Mexico City to visit the hospital of San Hipólito, that nowadays is used for weddings. So if anybody is interested in getting married in a hospital, in the first hospital for the mentally ill in America, it's possible to get married there, actually. So if anybody is interested, especially psychiatrists who love psychiatry, can get married there if they're still not married, or you want to get married for a second time. So this hospital of San Hipólito incorporated all the knowledge that we had from Spain and in the Hispanic world from Hispanic medicine. So classic medicine was used, purging, spiritual treatment with the priest as well, workshops, occupational therapy, gardens for farming. I mean, many of these things, many of these treatments that we wish we had nowadays, because we know that today inpatient psychiatry is in a crisis. It's not a pleasant experience to be admitted to an inpatient psychiatry unit where there is no freedom, where a person is all focused on safety, but the person, they cannot walk around. There are no true healing environment anymore. It's all focused on just safety, but there is not a true healing environment. And sometimes we see some examples in these 16th century hospitals, like for example San Hipólito, that was founded in 1567. We see these treatments, and one can only wonder, maybe we should learn from this. Maybe we should create true healing environments, a true residential care for people with mental illness that can be a true healing environment where patients could do farming with green spaces, where people can return to find a job, to where you can get vocational therapy and also treatment if needed. And there are some people who are arguing for this, for going back to this, or create different residential treatment options that can be more helpful. So San Hipólito in Mexico City became the official hospital for the mentally ill in Mexico until the 1910. Actually, until 1910, at that time they founded another hospital called La Castañeda. Another interesting thing is, like in San Hipólito, Bernardino thought that in Mexico that you could put the patients who were more mentally deprived or who lacked reason with people who had good judgment, and that way virtue could be learned. And virtue is something that comes from learning. Virtue is something that comes from Platonism, but it's also important for positive psychiatry. So positive psychiatry is based on this. It's based on something that Bernardino Alvarez was doing actually in the 16th century in Mexico. and comes from Platonism, from Plato originally. And another thing is like important to know is that José de Cabas, there were physicians there as well, and we know that from 16th century the first physician that we know there was José de Cabas. José de Cabas. So it's important that there was not like just a spiritual treatment, that there were physicians already at that time in Mexico. It's important also, I wanted to talk a little bit about the hospital in Saragossa. Saragossa, Spain. Saragossa comes from Caesar Augusta, which was the Roman city, but Saragossa now is the capital of the region of Aragon in Spain. And this hospital was founded in 1425, right after the hospital in Valencia, and became the hospital of Saragossa, the most important hospital, probably the most important hospital in Europe from 1425 until the 19th century, that was invaded by Napoleon. And what we know, I mean, it's important, I wanted to talk a little bit about this hospital, because we know that there was a report down in the city of Paris, in France, made by a French physician, that said that this hospital had outstanding and optimal medical care for the mentally ill in the 18th century. And this is before the Enlightenment and moral treatment and everything started. And he said that the patients were examined by a group of physicians before they were hospitalized, that the patients were visited by the hospital director every day, by the physicians twice a day, that patients had workshops, that they could participate in picking up olives, in farming, in sewing. There were all kind of workshops, and that many of them would recover. All of them would reside in the hospital. And this hospital became the model for later on what we call the moral treatment in Europe, because we know that Philippe Pinel, who is considered nowadays the father of psychiatry in Europe, and the father of psychiatry in general, Philippe Pinel had probably visited Saragossa at the time, and he knew about the hospital because in the second edition of his book Treatise of Insanity, that was published in 1809, I mean the first version was published in 1801, but in the 1809 version, he mentions the hospital of Saragossa in Spain as the most advanced hospital in Europe at the time, even more advanced than the ones he knew of in Germany and in England, and of course the ones he knew in France. I'm not saying these things in a nationalist way. I mean, I'm saying these things because I focus my research in the history of the Hispanic world, and this is the information that we have collected, and we have, I mean, enough documents to support that. So this hospital may have influenced the origin of moral treatment during the Enlightenment, and I think it's important to know about that. I mean, the hospital of Saragossa, unfortunately, disappeared in 1809 during the French invasion, in which Napoleon sieged the city. Many mentally ill patients died. This is a hospital that was admitting patients from all over the nations in Europe, from all over different nations and all over different parts of Spain. So it was the biggest mental hospital for the mentally ill in Spain. So people could be referred from Madrid, people could be referred from France, from Italy, and from all different places, because the treatment was very advanced there. But this hospital was bombed. Many of the patients died, and those patients who survived after the siege of Napoleon were protected by a person that should be remembered. I mean, the person called Father Monal, M-O-N-A-L, and this Father Monal protected the mentally ill that survived. So I think it is important. This is my last slide of today, or this lecture of History of Psychiatry. In the next lecture, we're going to review the history of psychiatry and the moral treatment and the Enlightenment era until the formation of the asylums. I hope you enjoyed it. This lecture focused a lot on the research that I've been doing in history of psychiatry in the Hispanic world, but I think it's important to know that a medical approach existed for the mentally ill since the times of Hippocrates, and that people receive optimal medical care in times of Hippocrates in antiquity and during the beginning of the Roman Empire. And also with Christianity, a religious approach took over, but this Greek physical treatment or medical treatment persisted in Islam, and thanks to the people in the Islamic Empire preserving this medical knowledge, it was translated later from Arab into Latin in Europe, and this treatment, this led to the foundation of different hospitals. That's continued the medical treatment. So this idea that psychiatry or on the treatment of the mental illness starts during the Enlightenment or in the 19th century is incorrect. You know, a medical treatment existed as soon as the antiquity, and then it came back in the late Middle Ages through Islam, and then this led to foundations of hospital in Spain, in America, in France, and different places, in Bedlam, in London, that people could receive medical approach to their mental afflictions. And this continued later on during the Enlightenment. So I think that's the most important idea to remember. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the video, and now we'll go to the next video that will be a little bit shorter. This was very long because this is my passion. This is what I've been doing research about in the last 2 or 3 years, but the next videos are going to be a little bit shorter. Thank you for your attention, and bye bye.